David, happy Friday to you. We're back for another episode. I don't know if you can detect any improvement in my audio quality, but I've been doing things to try to reduce the room ring here just in time for me to leave New York. How are you today, David?
Very good. Nice to be with you, Jason. I'm not sure I'd recognize room ring if it bit me on the nose, but you sound all right.
Yeah. It's, I think, a very subtle echo within the room that is caused by the fact that these are bare walls and there's nothing to absorb sound, but I put some foam around that hopefully will improve the audio quality. David, we're going to be talking today about some details regarding a subject that you've been quite interested in and sharing information with our audience about for some time. Why don't you give us some background on what this Highway of Tears is and why it's such a troubling phenomenon there in Canada?
Well, absolutely. And about 4,000 Aboriginal women disappeared or murdered along, well, not just the Highway of Tears, but across Canada since the 1980s, beginning of the 1980s. And the RCMP, or Police with Concern, sometimes attribute it to a lone trucker who's gone rogue, if you will. My feeling is if some organization can get away with 4,000 murders of Aboriginal women over decades, it's got to be rather a sophisticated organization that has technology, for example, necessary to track where the police are, where the women and girls are, where the truck drivers are, if they want to set up a narrative that it's a truck driver, perhaps that's abducted a woman and killed her. So what your image shows some of the key decision makers in the development of the technology of population control, if you will, including Pierre Trudeau, who died in 2000, shaking hands, in this case, with Mao Tse-tung, probably the greatest mass murderer of the 19th century. Many people would attribute about 65 million dead to this man. Obviously a psychopath. Very disturbing is that what he did or introduced was the idea of population control through one-child families, and he was put up to that by one of Pierre Trudeau's mentors, a guy called Maurice Strong. And Maurice Strong was a Stalinist and depopulationist and an all-round psychopath. And he believes the only way of saving the planet was to destroy the rich industrialized countries and depopulate them. And he's long dead. Well, not so long dead, but he's been, I would suggest, very successful.
Well, it seems to be what's happening right now, isn't it, David?
You got it. You got it. So what, as you know, what I'm very interested in, the technologies needed to implement something on the scale. And so if I go back to 1968, 69, Pierre Trudeau was the president of the Queen's Privy Council of Canada, the most important bureaucrat in the country, interfacing between the politicians and the bureaucracy. So basically, he could get what he wanted by telling the bureaucrats to issue contracts in this area. And amazingly, they offered a contract, I believe, to McDonald Detweiler, that was generated by a couple of alumni from UBC, to develop the tracking technology, including the mobile radio data management systems that would be absolutely essential if you wanted to abduct a woman on a remote highway and take her away to some foul deed in a hotel or some city where a film might be made of the manner of her death, which would incorporate images of the people who participated. It became an extraordinarily effective entrapment and extortion racket and blackmail racket. So 4,000.
It reminds me, David, of the story that you've told us about this hairdresser that you spoke with, whose brother was at the pig farm raves and said that he would rather commit suicide than ever discuss what actually happened there.
Absolutely. And if you go to China with the one-child policy, what Mao Tse-tung, well, at least I think he died in 1976, so this one-child operation took place or started in earnest in 1979, 1980, at the same time as the women were disappearing along the Highway of Tears. And I think what the handshake between Pierre Trudeau and Mao Tse-tung was a handshake to transfer the technology developed at UBC by those two alumni, including in the areas of artificial intelligence, to transfer that technology into communist China. So the apparatchiks in the Chinese Communist Party could plant snitches in these remote villages, right, who would then watch for women who might have a second child or a third child and farm out the second or third child to a grandmother or whatever to try and protect themselves. And so Mao Tse-tung and his successors would need people planted inside the village who were effectively, if you will, double agents that could use a local communication or radio communications to headquarters and say, here's a woman, she's got a 6-month-old baby over in that farm over there, send someone to kill it. So they had teams of abortionists and infanticides going around the country, and over a period of, I don't know how long, they claim to have perhaps terminated 400 million fetuses, predominantly girls,
Ooh.
right? Because in China at the time, the firstborn, they like to have a boy because the boy is deemed to be able to look after the family subsequently. And then the second child. So various laws and rules have relaxed or perhaps tightened up. But essentially now the Communist Party, in a joint venture with Canada, and I believe this family maintenance enforcement program, right, is now inside the signals intelligence networks of the Five Eyes countries through what Dr. Cameron Ortis would call a compromised node. That is a family-based structure where within a large family, or not even a large family, a small family, there are always people incredibly vulnerable to blackmail, entrapment, or extortion of their money, which can then be transferred into a criminal network. So my allegation is that family maintenance enforcement program, which is underneath the British Columbia Ministry of the Attorney General, is actually an essential component in payoff controls of an international criminal organization that reaches every country in the world. Over to you.
Yeah, it's interesting, David, because as I started looking at this, you were telling me about this last night, and normally what I do when you introduce some kind of new agency or company or whatever, I go to the webpage, I look it up, I try to find the address so that we can show the building in the background or something like that. But this agency was very difficult to find. It's using post office boxes to obscure its actual location. And you know something funny, David? I know somebody who does that, using post office boxes to obscure the actual location. It seems to be the activity of shady, shadowy people who are doing things that they don't want to be held accountable for. Everybody knows where I live. I show the place all the time, and it's been listed in so many federal lawsuits and posted on the internet through doxing. Before we get back to what we're going to be discussing in just about 20 minutes on our sponsor exclusive segment that people can join us for on subscribestar.com/reversecsi, patreon.com/reversecsi storyboards, or subscribestar.com and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. I first want to thank, David, all the generous sponsors that have made this show possible. You and I have been doing shows for years now, and one of the things I've been using the sponsorship funds for, as I've mentioned to many people, in addition to fighting the lawsuits, is to create a video server that will allow us to keep Crowdsource the Truth sponsor exclusive videos away from some of these organizations that are controlled by people that perhaps have political agendas that we don't agree with. And by that, I don't mean Democrats versus Republicans. I'm talking about companies like Vimeo that are owned by Barry Diller's Interactive Corporation, that when we start to expose things that are linked to what you're describing, these influence networks, people like Peter Nygaard, people like Jeffrey Epstein, who have been arrested for, prosecuted for, accused of pedophilia, child abuse, etc. Sometimes there's people who don't like us talking about that stuff. They try to equate us to these really absurd online movements. But the point I'm getting at is, not long ago, David, I think it was August, you and I did a sponsor exclusive segment that featured an interview with a StarNet Communications whistleblower, a woman who used to work there. And this is one of the videos from our library of sponsor exclusive videos that was decimated when Vimeo totally deleted that account. Now, there were two instances where this occurred, because I didn't know this, but you get in trouble with Vimeo simply for re-uploading videos that have already been deleted. So we're not doing that anymore. Sponsor-exclusive videos still reach our sponsors over Vimeo, but the legacy library is now being restored via the Crowdsource the Truth video server, and we're in a beta test right now, David, so it's only available to our sponsors who are on Subscribestar. So people who subscribe to subscribestar.com/reverse-CSI or subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth can now begin to access some of the legacy library that had been previously deleted by Vimeo. Isn't that cool?
Oh, that's a great step forward. So I think now what I'd like to convey in the remaining minutes of this part of the show is I'd like Americans to start considering this organization, which is a virtual organization. Like you say, it's got no post office. It's got no apparent office. It's got post office boxes. So it's a virtual organization, which would be a classic example of what would be needed if you had to establish payoff controls for murder for hire operation. Where you're actually recruiting people, perhaps from within the family, to extort concessions from other members of the family. So you implied there was a couple of people who use post office box, but I believe what you're referring to is actually someone who is constantly hacking away at Crowdsource the Truth from a refuge in what might very well prove to be a compromised node, paid through the family maintenance and enforcement program. That is to say, virtual applause, some kind of reward, some kind of concession, some kind of participatory, pleasure that you in participating in this. So we're actually dealing with a virtual network or a virtual floating matrix that collects $200 million a year, and since its formation in 1988, has actually collected $4 billion. Which it extracts from certain members of families, often men who are ridiculed, bankrupted, jailed, or overseas, and gives it to an organization that is prominently to the benefit of mothers and children. So essentially, you have an extraordinary method of rewarding extortion, right? Because the men are vulnerable to being extorted, so are the women, of course. The women that may be killed on the Highway of Tears or killed in China, which have actually got an international crime syndicate, what I would call I think an online criminal insurgency, that is able to deploy vast amounts of money sheltered within a government, that is to say, the BC Ministry of the Attorney General. And this reaches into the United States because they have reciprocity arrangements, right? Where, let's say, someone has conceived or is liable for child support in Canada and then goes to the United States to get a job. But the United States has an agreement with Canada where the United States Department of Justice, right, where there's some really interesting people, can go after that individual to extort from them. And when I say extort, I'm not arguing with child support. What I am arguing with is who pays how much to whom. There is no transparency and no accountability in this system. I consider it as a front for a criminal organization, an international criminal organization that can put on a murder or an attack anywhere in the world at short notice. Over to you.
And David, I'm always looking at these symbols. I know you've spoken to us quite a bit about IJCAI, the Joint Conference on Artificial Intelligence. This is where the term payoff control is coming from, if I'm correct, right?
Correct.
And I'm looking at this, David, this little Ijkai pyramid logo. It reminds me very much of the Academy Awards. You know, the Oscars uses a similar kind of logo here. It's just remarkably similar when you see it right next to it. I mean, look at that.
Oh, well, and you see, and I think phrases perhaps are convenient. I call this Ijkai Murder Inc., right? Murder Inc. used to be an establishment where the chief hoods would meet in a hotel. The disadvantage of that hotel would get raided. Some of the hoods would be put behind bars and some were executed. So it wasn't a very good idea to meet in public or in a hotel. So they've transformed that, in my opinion, to Ijkai Murder Inc., where the International Joint Conference on Artificial Intelligence, which used to meet every 2 years and now meets every year. This year it's going to be in Montreal. And they decide on who and what they're going to attack in the year ahead. And these people, they assemble, the smartest computer scientists in the world. I was at the Ijkai conference in Vancouver in 1981. I was trying to tell these people, never grasping the enormity of the conspiracy that might develop, because these people have no compassion or empathy. The program, the artificial intelligence algorithms, for example, presently navigate prisoners through permitted and prohibited dwell times at crime scenes, right? So when they raided Starnet, if you recollect, 150 law enforcement officers from compromised nodes in the FBI, the CIA, the IRS and US Customs and Vancouver, Coquitlam and RCM police raided this place, which was engaged in hardcore adult and child pornography in 60 countries with a market cap of nearly $1 billion.
David, let me just add something real quick while we're talking about that, because, one of the things that they've been attempting to do to smear people with this ridiculous online 17th letter of the alphabet operation is to say that anybody who accuses anybody of anything having to do with pedophilia must be a crazy conspiracy theorist. But David, this is an article from Newsweek from 1999, and this is the thing that talks about them producing hardcore pornography. Does this mention child pornography in this article?
There is a Vimeo link on one of my posts, which actually describes the news reader talking about the raid on the day of, right? Yeah. And talking about these people being engaged in hardcore adult and child pornography. So presumably the raiding party, which was 150 law enforcement officers, they raided knowing that this outfit was in child pornography. And if you recollect, this was 1999, when Justin Trudeau's roommate, Christopher Charles Ingvelson,
right,
was accused of directing an international pedophile ring. So I believe Christopher Charles Ingvelson and Justin Trudeau were very likely involved in directing the Starnet operations into 60 countries around the world, which should be thought of as basically a family maintenance and enforcement program, or a family murder and extortion program. Same thing, FMEP, right? With a reach, right, that goes from 1988 to the present, which now is extorting people, for example, up at the Allard School of Law, where people were being snitched on because they might have violated some of the COVID rules.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I wanted to bring up about that is that Newsweek has also been owned by Interactive Corp, the same company that owns Vimeo and deletes our videos when we talk about stuff like this. So, it's even more reason as to why this stuff needs to be put on a Crowdsource the Truth server in order for people to be able to see it. And it also, I think, David, it explains why we're constantly under attack. I mean, this Starnet Communications raid that's spoken about in Newsweek and that CBC report that you've got linked on Vimeo, I think it's been deleted from Vimeo, hasn't it, that CBC link?
No, well, I found it and I can get it back somewhere. It's a fascinating link because the man in charge probably of that raid was Bob Paulson, who would go on to become the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Commissioner, right, who would fast track Dr. Cameron Ortis, right, into his study of compromised nodes and cybersecurity in East Asia. Now, as anyone who's been listening know, Dr. Cameron Ortis is now in jail, and I believe he's been put in jail because the compromised nodes that he discovered were actually associated with the Family Maintenance Enforcement Program of the British Columbia Ministry of the Attorney General, which I think could be used extremely efficiently to pay off murder for hire, because you've got a $200 million cash flow, right? It's running through 31,000 families, but it requires confiscating the money from one part of the family and giving it to another part of the family, which of course destroys the family, because now there's a permanent grudge built into the family itself. And so we might ask ourselves, well, who's vulnerable? Why not the family of Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Bill Clinton, etc.? So no family is so powerful that it can exclude the possibility that one of its members has been compromised and blackmailed. And it may be in the case of the Biden, it's Hunter Biden, right? So essentially what you've got, until you tackle the core payoff controls, which are now being distributed through artificial intelligence algorithms developed by those guys up at the University of British Columbia. Over to you.
Yeah. And David, we're just a few minutes away now from our sponsor exclusive segment that's going to begin on Subscribestar and Patreon. I hope that people will choose to sponsor David, both of us, but either you or I. The show is simulcast on both Subscribestar and Patreon for Reverse CSI and Crowdsource the Truth. We're going to go into extensive detail on all of these things. I think it's also important for people to remember that Bloomberg News article about a Chinese hack destroying Canada's greatest tech company. And that, of course, was the whole Nortel Huawei dust up. Do you want to give people just a quick overview of how that plays into what you're talking about?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So let's go back to the technology developed for tracking people and population control. That was pioneered by McDonald Detweiler, including the system for mobile data management, which would be very useful for identifying victims on the Highway of Tears. So McDonald Detweiler sold that technology to Motorola. And Motorola is one of the plaintiffs in that lawsuit against Huawei. Well, it's actually the Department of Justice for racketeering, but Motorola was one of the organizations.
Well, but wait a minute, isn't that separate? It's a criminal charge from the Department of Justice and a lawsuit from somebody else, right?
Yeah, no. Let me back up here. The Department of Justice has brought unsealed an indictment against Huawei for a criminal conspiracy regarding the theft of intellectual property and trade secrets. One of the companies from whom or from which Huawei stole was Motorola.
Right.
But Motorola had bought the technology for mobile data tracking from McDonald Detweiler, and therefore Huawei would have been in a position, for example, on 911, I believe, to get inside the technology required by the firefighters to evacuate that building. So it's quite subtle, but if you follow the patents and the intellectual property and trade secrets, what China has done, aided and abetted, I believe, by Pierre Trudeau, has stolen some of the most important artificial intelligence and tracking technologies from the West, including Cisco and Motorola and Nortel, and is now using it for population control through some of the universities in the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada. Over to you.
Wow. It's really a shocking set of circumstances, David. Well, we're just about out of time here. I hope that people will join us in 5 minutes on subscribestar.com/reversecsi, patreon.com/reversecsi storyboards, or subscribestar.com and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. We can't do this show without viewer sponsors like you guys. So I hope that people are asking if I'm considering doing an October 1st follow-up. October 1st, you're talking about Vegas. I don't know if that has anything to do with what we're doing right now, but we'll see everybody in just a few minutes on Patreon and Subscribestar.